All right, so, LaVar Ball, right? That basketball dad, always kind of outspoken and in the headlines.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, he recently had to have his foot amputated.
Oh, wow.
And it got me thinking, like, what leads someone to needing an amputation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's definitely something that goes beyond just the usual sports news. It really raises a serious question about what kind of situations would lead someone to need such a drastic procedure.
Yeah, for sure. And the reports I saw just mentioned like a serious medical issue, but no specifics.
Hmm.
So I'm really curious what kind of health problems could actually make that necessary.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to try to unpack today. We're going to go beyond those headlines and really look into the medical reasons that can be behind foot amputations.
Okay, cool. So I think when I think about amputations, and maybe a lot of people think about this too, the first thing that pops into my head is diabetes.
Right.
Is that accurate? Like, is that a major factor?
Yeah, you're spot on. Diabetes is definitely a major factor when it comes to amputations, and that's because it can really restrict blood flow to your extremities.
So what happens then? How does that restricted blood flow lead to amputation?
Well, when that blood flow is reduced, it's almost like that lifeline is being pinched off to your tissues, and that can start with things like numbness and a tingling. But it can progress to much more serious problems like ulcers that just won't heal or infections that keep coming back.
Oh, wow. So you're saying it's not like a sudden out of the blue thing. It's more gradual.
Exactly. It's definitely often a gradual process, and doctors will actually try many different things to save the limb. They might try medications, wound care, even some less invasive procedures, but sometimes it reaches a point where amputation really becomes the only option to stop that infection from spreading and ultimately to save the person's life.
Okay, that makes sense. But thinking about LeVar Ball again, it seemed to happen pretty quickly. Are there other situations where maybe it's more of an immediate response?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about a situation where there's severe trauma, like a car accident or a really bad crush injury,
Oh, yeah.
anything that could really damage those bones and the tissues and the blood vessels in the foot, amputation might be necessary in those cases, especially if the blood flow can't be restored quickly enough.
I see. So it's like to prevent further complications.
Exactly.
Okay, what about infections? Could those lead to amputation even if someone doesn't have diabetes?
Yeah, for sure. Infections are another really big factor. And this is especially true in limbs that maybe already have poor circulation because these infections, they can spread so quickly. And in some cases, they can lead to things like gangrene or sepsis, which is a life-threatening reaction to infection.
Oh, wow.
And so in those really serious situations, amputation might be necessary to stop that spread and again, save the person's life.
It's crazy how many different factors there are.
Yeah.
Like we've got diabetes, severe injuries, infections. Are there any other common causes we should know about?
Yeah, there's one more that we should definitely touch on, and that's peripheral artery disease, or PLD. It's very similar to what happens with diabetes, where those arteries become narrowed and that blood flow is reduced.
Okay.
But the thing about PAD is that it can happen to anyone, even if you don't have diabetes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that's what's so important to understand about it, because it can often go undiagnosed until it's already quite advanced.
Oh, wow.
So it's super important to know those risk factors and to get regular checkups for early detection.
It's kind of crazy how something seemingly simple like blood flow can have such a huge impact.
It really is. It just shows how interconnected our bodies are.
Yeah, and it kind of brings us back to this idea of amputation as like a spectrum. Like it's
Mhm.
not always a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. And
Exactly.
actually seeing pictures of LaVar after his surgery, he seemed pretty upbeat.
Oh, good.
Does amputation always mean losing the entire foot?
That's a great question. And, it really highlights how important it is to remember that the extent of an amputation, whether a toe part of the foot or the whole foot, really depends on how severe the condition is and how much healthy tissue the doctors can save.
So it's really about trying to preserve as much function as possible.
Exactly. And that's where things like rehabilitation and prosthetic technology come in. They really help people adapt to their new reality and regain as much mobility and independence as they can.
So even though we're talking about a serious medical procedure, there's still hope for a good quality of life afterwards.
Oh, absolutely. There have been so many advancements in prosthetics and rehabilitation. There are options out there for everyday use for athletes, even for really specialized activities. It's amazing how technology can help people adapt and thrive after an amputation.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
So hearing all this really puts things in perspective. What stands out to you as like the most important takeaway so far?
For me, I think it's just the reminder that there isn't just one single path that leads to someone needing an amputation. It could be a long-term consequence of something like diabetes. It could be a sudden response to a traumatic injury, or even a race against time to stop a spreading infection. There are so many different entry points, so to speak.
That's a really good point. There are so many different ways this can happen.
Yeah.
It sounds like understanding those entry points is really key, especially when we're talking about something like diabetes,
Mm-hmm.
which we know is such a major factor. What is it specifically about diabetes that makes amputation such a risk?
Well, one of the big issues with diabetes is that it can lead to something called diabetic neuropathy.
Okay.
And basically what that is nerve damage.
Oh, wow.
And it can cause numbness in your feet. So you might not even notice if you have like a small cut or a sore on your foot.
Oh, that's kind of scary. So you could have an injury and not even realize it.
Exactly. And that brings us to kind of the second big issue with diabetes, which is poor blood circulation.
Right?
So when that blood flow to your feet is reduced because of the diabetes, those sores and cuts that you might not even notice, they have a really hard time healing.
So it's like a double whammy. You
Exactly.
don't feel the injury, and then it can't heal properly. What happens then?
Well, if bacteria get into those open wounds, it can lead to some really serious infections, and those infections can spread really deep into the tissues and even reach the bone.
Oh, gosh.
And that can lead to a condition called osteomyelitis, which unfortunately often requires amputation to stop it from spreading further.
Wow. So it can really become life-threatening.
Exactly.
This all really underscores how important early detection is,
Mm-hmm.
and just like careful foot care for anyone with diabetes.
Absolutely. Regular foot checks, proper hygiene, wearing shoes that fit well, those are all so important. And of course, managing your blood sugar levels is really key to preventing these complications from even developing in the first place.
Right. So for someone with diabetes, managing their condition is about so much more than just blood sugar.
Ex-
It's really about protecting their limbs too.
you got it.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about diabetes,
Yeah.
but let's move on to peripheral artery disease, or PAD.
Okay.
You mentioned that it's similar to diabetes in terms of that blood flow,
Right.
but that it can affect anyone.
Mm-hmm.
So what exactly is PAD, and why does it lead to amputation in some cases?
So PAD happens when plaque builds up inside your arteries.
Okay.
And it's like this slow, silent buildup that gradually narrows those arteries, and that reduces the blood flow to your legs and feet.
So it's kind of like having clogged pipes,
Yeah, good way to think about
but
it.
in your body.
Exactly. And just like we talked about with diabetes, that reduced blood flow means that wounds are going to heal a lot slower,
Right.
and they're much more susceptible to infection. And if those infections become really severe or spread to the bone, then amputation might become necessary to prevent even further complications.
I see. So what can you do about PAD? Is it similar to managing diabetes?
Yeah, there are definitely some similarities. Lifestyle changes are really important things like quitting smoking, exercising regularly are crucial for improving blood flow and reducing that plaque buildup. And then medications can also help to control things like blood pressure and cholesterol, which can contribute to PED. And in some cases, a doctor might recommend some procedures to actually open up those blocked arteries.
This is all really important information.
Yeah.
Like you said earlier, understanding these conditions and being aware of those early warning signs can make such a huge difference.
Absolutely. Now, we've talked about some of those more gradual causes of amputation,
Right.
but let's shift gears and talk about those situations where amputation is needed after like a sudden traumatic event.
Right. Like we talked earlier about those accidents and injuries, and how sometimes it could be a life-saving measure.
Exactly. So think about things like crust injuries, where the bones and tissues in your foot are just severely damaged, or a really high impact accident like a motorcycle crash that could sever those arteries and nerves. In those cases, if the blood flow can't be restored quickly enough, amputation might be the only way to control that bleeding and prevent a really life-threatening infection from developing.
It's incredible how complex these situations can be,
Yeah.
and how each decision that's made is such a delicate balance between trying to preserve the limb, but also making sure that the person is going to be okay.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Doctors really carefully consider all those factors. The extent of the injury, the risk of infection, the overall health of the patient, all of that comes into play before making the decision about amputation. It's not a decision that's made lightly.
So even in those situations where it's an emergency,
Yeah.
it's not just about removing the limb, it's about making the best decision for that person's long-term well-being.
Exactly. And even after an amputation, there's a long road to recovery. There's rehabilitation, there's pain management, and potentially the use of prosthetics. It's a major life adjustment, and the support and care that someone receives during that time are just so crucial.
Yeah. Which brings us back to LaVar Ball. We don't know the specifics of his case, of course, but he seemed to have a really positive attitude after his surgery.
Yeah.
It seemed like he was determined to make the best of a really difficult situation.
Yeah, his resilience is really admirable, and it just highlights something really important. Even though amputation is a very serious medical procedure with the right support and the right mindset, people can really adapt and live fulfilling lives.
Yeah, and that's where those advancements in prosthetic technology really play a big role, right?
Oh, absolutely. We've come such a long way from those basic wooden limbs of the past.
Yeah.
Today's prosthetics are incredibly sophisticated. There are options for everyday use for athletes, even for highly specialized activities. There are even advancements being made in mind-controlled prosthetics.
Well,
It's really remarkable.
yeah, it really is amazing how technology is helping people regain their mobility and independence after something like this.
Yeah,
So there's really a lot of hope for a good quality of life.
absolutely. So we've covered really the main reasons why someone might need a foot amputation.
Yeah.
Diabetes, PED, severe injuries, infections. We talked about the importance of early detection and prevention, and the amazing role of rehab and technology in helping people adapt. This has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
It has been.
So what's your biggest aha moment? Knowing what we know now.
I think for me, it's realizing just how many different paths can lead to amputation. It's not always this predictable, straightforward situation. Sometimes it's a long, gradual process, and sometimes it's a sudden response to an emergency. It's really made me think about how important it is to be proactive with our health.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually highlights something that we haven't talked about as much yet, which is the role of preventative care. Because a lot of the conditions that we talked about today, like diabetes, PAD, even some infections, are really influenced by the choices that we make in our daily lives.
So are you saying that while the advancements in things like prosthetics and rehabilitation are amazing, preventing the need for amputation in the first place should be like the top priority?
Absolutely. Healthy habits, regular checkups, and just being aware of what's going on in your own body can really make such a huge difference. It's about taking ownership of your health.
Yeah, and it feels like we've come full circle now.
Mm-hmm.
We started by talking about LaVar Ball's situation,
Right.
and now we're talking about how we can empower ourselves to take control of our own health and potentially avoid ending up in those circumstances.
Exactly. And while we may never know the specifics of LaVar's case, his story is a really good reminder that these health challenges can happen to anyone, and that resilience and a positive attitude can go such a long way.
Yeah, it was really inspiring to see him facing this head on. It's a reminder that even when life throws us curveballs, we can adapt and overcome them with the right mindset and support.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, this has been such an insightful deep dive. We went from a headline about a celebrity's foot amputation to a much deeper understanding of the medical reasons behind it and the importance of prevention and the power of human resilience. It's been an amazing journey.
It has been.
So as we wrap up, is there a final thought-provoking question that you want to leave our listener with?
Yeah, I think the question I'd like to leave everyone with is, what small changes can you make today to really prioritize your health and potentially avoid these circumstances that might lead to amputation down the road?
That's a really powerful question to think about, and it's a reminder that we often have more control over our health than we realize.
Exactly. It's about taking ownership, being proactive, and making those choices that really support your long-term well-being.
This has been such a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with me today.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listener, we hope you found this deep dive informative and empowering. Remember, knowledge is power. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and take care of yourself.